All right, welcome back. So if you watched the last video, we talked about how a stack is a LIFO, however you pronounce it, last in, first out data structure. And there's more than one way to create something like that. In fact, a stack is just a concept. It's basically a set of rules that says, okay, you need to be able to store data in such a way that the first thing added in is the last thing removed. The last thing added in is the first thing removed. And it doesn't really define how you do that. It's just a concept. So there's more than one way of doing it. And the easiest way is to use an array. So some some programming languages come with their own stack data type, but we can still use a built-in array or list data type to create our own stack. So all that we have to do is store data in here in a way that the first thing is the last thing removed and the last thing in is the first thing removed. So if I hop over to my console, if I make a new array, I'm just going to call it stack, and it starts out empty. Let's say that I'm storing web pages that I've visited, and I'm creating a history of where I've been. Okay, so to add something into this stack, how do we add to an array? Well, there's a couple options, but let's just use push. So I'll push, I start at google.com. Okay, so we push Google in. And then let's say from Google, I go to, Instagram. And then one more site that I go to is YouTube. My stack now has 3 things in it. So in order for this to be a stack, I need to have a way to remove from it where the most recently added thing is what I get first. So when I remove from here, I want to start by getting YouTube. And then next time I should get Instagram and then Google. So how would I do that? Well, there's a method to do it. Stack.pop. Well, array.pop. So pop is going to remove from the end. So using push and pop in tandem on an array creates a stack, as long as that's how we're adding and removing. If somebody goes and adds something to the middle of the array or to the beginning or removes from the beginning, then it's not quite functioning as a stack anymore. But if we just push and pop, like if we're trying to use a stack in our code, which that's actually something we'll do later on, is use an array as a stack just because it's simpler. And if I pop, I get YouTube and then Instagram. If I push something else in there, like let's say I go to Amazon, now when I remove using pop, I'll get Amazon first. It was the last thing added in, so it's the first thing I get out. And then one more time, I get Google. So that's one way of using an array to create a stack structure. But we could do it another way using built-in array methods. Can you think of how that would work? We're working with the end of the array right now. We're adding to the end and removing from the end. There's another way. Well, there's at least one way. If I make some space here, I think I still have an empty, caps lock. I have this empty array. Well, if I add to the beginning of the array, I could do that. So how do we add to the beginning? Well, you can use unshift, the confusingly titled method. And let's say this time we're modeling, my Photoshop history. So I start with create new file. And then the next thing that I did, what did I do afterwards? I resized file, and then I removed, cloned out wrinkle or something like that in Photoshop. Okay, so our stack has 3 things in there. In order for this to work, the last thing in needs to come out first. So I can't pop anymore because pop will remove from here, meaning it will take from the end, which this is the first thing added in. We don't want the first thing in to be the first thing out. We want the opposite. We want the last thing in to be the first thing out. So I use unshift to add and shift to remove, which will remove from the beginning. Cloned out wrinkle, resize file, create new file. So both of these approaches are valid stacks. They work. It's all that matters is that we have a way of adding data in and removing data such that it satisfies this last in, first out principle. The first thing in is the last thing out. The last thing in is the first thing out. But there's a distinction between these two. Pushing and popping was the first thing we did, meaning we're adding to the end and removing from the end. And then we also talked about shift and unshift, adding and removing from the beginning. So based off of what we've talked about with arrays earlier on, which is better? What's more efficient? What's the problem with one of these? Well, if we think about how arrays work, remember that adding to the beginning, removing from the beginning is not good. As far as big O notation, time complexity, What we have to do is, if we have an array with 3 things in here, each item has an index, and if I add something to the very beginning, we have to re-index all the other items, because this is no longer going to be index 0. This will no longer be index 1. Everything gets shifted down. Okay, so if we have this stack with these 3 items in here, if I unshift again, and this time I add something else in, like, I don't know, I'm just doing dumb abbreviations, all of these indices have to be shifted down, and that's very inefficient. I mean, for 4 items, it's not really a problem at all, but just it's worth considering if we have a lot of data. It's not a great way of doing it. Instead, if we use push, we're adding to the end. We just have to create a new spot, a new index, and add, index of 4. But we don't have to re-index every other item in there. It is worth mentioning that if you actually care about the efficiency, then you probably don't want to use an array for a stack. If you're going to have a ton of data in there, all you need is this last in, first out capability. We'll use our second implementation coming up where we use a linked list. There's no reason to have these indices. We're not accessing information based off of an index. We're simply accessing information based off of when it was inserted. The order needs to be preserved, and a linked list will do that for us. So to recap, we can use an array to create a stack. We can use push and pop in tandem so that the first thing added in is the last thing out. The last thing added in is the first thing out. I know I'm a broken record on that. Or we could use shift and unshift. Unshift to add to the beginning, shift to remove from the beginning of the array. So it doesn't matter what direction we're doing it in, if we're adding down here or adding over here, as long as we're removing from that same direction, if that makes sense. But in general, if you are going to use an array, push and pop are the better options because it doesn't require re-indexing the entire array every time you add or remove something. You just have to create a new index at the end or remove that index. Okay, so next up, I'll show you an implementation of a stack using a linked list.